Hi, welcome to part 2 of this Blender modeling tutorial. Today we are going to look at some tools and some object modifiers. When you start Blender and come to the splash screen, instead of selecting General, you can just click on the background. To the left you have a toolbar. It has more options in edit mode. Like most things in Blender's user interface, you can resize it by dragging. Then you see the name of each tool. If you press space, you also get the toolbar and you can see all the keyboard shortcuts. For example, the select tool is B. Some of them have variations indicated by the little arrow on each icon. If you press on the icon, it will bring up a menu of options. I will show some of the most useful tools. First, we have the Extrude tool. Select the face, click this icon or hit E and move the mouse. It will extrude the face in the direction of the face, either outwards or inwards, and create new geometry. You can enter a value if you want it to be exact, or use snapping, either by turning it on with Shift-Tab or holding Ctrl. You can also constrain the extrusion to one of the axes by pressing X, Y, or Z. If you change your mind and cancel the extrusion with Escape, there is an invisible danger lurking. The extrusion is still there because you only cancelled the movement, and now you have invisible duplicated geometry, which is very likely to come and bite you. So you should also press Ctrl Z to undo the last step. Or, instead of using Escape, it's a better habit to confirm the extrusion and then undo it. This way you will never forget the undo step. There are variants of the tool with different effects. You can, for example, select several faces and use Extrude along normals. You also find further options in the operator panel. You can also extrude just an edge or a vertex. The next tool is Inset with the hotkey I. It creates a face within a face, or actually several, since the smaller face is surrounded by new connecting faces. If you have several faces selected, it's sometimes useful to check the individual option in the operator panel. You can also choose Outset. For example, if you already have an inset and want to create a border around it. And then you can tick Select Outer to have the new outset selected. Then you can, for example, extrude it, and you have something like a window frame. The Bevel tool cuts into edges of a mesh. Mark one or several edges and press Ctrl B and move the mouse to adjust the bevel. In the operator panel, you can adjust the number of segments and the general shape. If you select Custom, there are a number of presets. You can select one of these and customize the profile. You create new points by clicking on the curve, and then you can drag them around. The Steps preset is a quick way to create stairs. With the Loop Cut tool, you create cuts around the whole mesh. The shortcut is Ctrl R. If you then scroll up on the scroll wheel, you increase the number of cuts. You can then slide the cuts along the mesh before placing them, or hit Escape if you want them centered. Press K to use the Knife tool. It lets you create cuts freely in a mesh by clicking. X, Y, and Z will constrain the knife to that direction. Ctrl Z to undo the latest point. Hold Ctrl to turn off the automatic snapping. And press Enter to confirm the cut. If you want the cut to go through the mesh, press C when you have the tool active. The knife tool is useful to create complex shapes, for example in a plane, delete the part you don't want, and then use Extrude to make it three-dimensional. Just using these 5 tools, Extrude, Inset, Bevel, Loop Cut and Knife, combined with the basic transforms Move, Rotate and Scale, lets you, in principle, create pretty much anything. But Blender has more to offer to simplify the creation of complex shapes. As I mentioned in part 1, the area to the lower right contains the Properties editor, containing properties for all kinds of things related to your current scene. Under the little blue wrench, we have the modifiers. Modifiers modify an object in a procedural way. This means that their effects are not permanent to the object's mesh until they are applied, much like the basic object transforms, translate, scale and rotate we talked about in part 1. They can also be combined for interesting effects. I will show a few useful ones. Use the Array modifier to create an array of identical objects. Enter the total number of objects you want. You can select an offset relative to the object size, or a constant one, or actually both. Now you have something that is very similar to the instances we talked about in part 1. If you go to edit mode, you can only edit the original object, but all the copies in the array are modified, since they are not independent objects. When you add a modifier to an object, the object will get a wrench symbol next to it in the outliner. The mirror modifier mirrors the object along the selected axis. If it doesn't seem to work as you expected, make sure you've applied any object transform. If I summon our primate friend Suzanne, we can see that she looks pretty blocky, even with shade smooth. What we can do is to add a modifier called Subdivision. If we increase the level to 2, it subdivides again, and it looks even better, but be a bit careful with this, since the geometry quadruples for each step, so you can create an insane amount of geometry with just a few steps. Watch the numbers to the lower right. It has shortcuts. Ctrl 1 adds a subdivide with 1 step, Ctrl 2 with 2, and so on up to 5. If you have 2 objects, the Boolean modifier lets you create either the intersection, the union, or the difference between the 2. Have the object you want to modify selected, add the Boolean modifier, use the eyedropper and click on the other object, or use the drop-down and select it. You should hide the other object to see the effect. If you use intersect, it will keep the part that was common for the 2 objects. If you select union, it will keep both. This is slightly different than just merging the two objects, since it won't keep the geometry on the inside, which usually is good since we don't want hidden geometry. And finally, if you select difference, it will subtract the second object from the first. This is useful for cutting holes, and I've been using it a lot for doors and windows. So far, I've only showed one modifier at a time, but you can stack them. With array, for example, you can have one in the X direction and another one in Y. If you do that, it can be a good idea to start giving them descriptive names like array X and array Y. When you are happy with the result, you can apply them one after another by clicking on the little arrow or using Ctrl A, but you don't have to apply them right away. Modifiers are non-destructive, but as soon as you have applied them, they are permanent and you will have to edit each part separately. So think twice before you apply your modifiers. I often keep them until it's time for exporting, and then I often copy everything to a new collection so I can go back and change things later. The modifiers are applied in the order of the list. Top one first, then the next, and so on. If you want to apply all the modifiers in one go, you can right-click on your object and select Convert to Mesh. Reordering modifiers can produce a different result. Take for example Mirror and Subdivide. If I move the standard cube 1 meter to the left, apply the transform, and then add first a mirror and then a subdivision, I will get this ellipsoid shape. But if I reorder them by dragging on the dots to the right, I get two separate things instead. If you don't get the result you expected, perhaps you need to apply object transforms first, as I just did in this example. For example, if I have a cube and rotate it, say 90 degrees around Z, and forget that I did that, and later add an array modifier, and tell it to go in the X direction, it will instead point in the Y direction. If I then press Ctrl A and apply the rotation transform, the array now points in the intended direction. Now I will show in quick succession some more useful editing functions. You can slide vertices along edges and edges along faces using slide. Activate it with either Ctrl V or by pressing G twice. Sliding instead of just moving is useful if the edge is not aligned with an axis, or if the model has been textured, since it won't affect the texture and cause stretching. I will show how this looks when we talk about texturing. Mark two edges, right-click and select Subdivide to split the face in two, or select the whole face to subdivide it along both directions. You can use the Bevel tool on a subdivision. If you delete something, the thing you had selected and the connecting geometry will be gone. If you instead choose Dissolve, the thing you had selected will be removed, but the connecting geometry will still be there and still be connected. Alt-click in Edge Select mode to select the entire edge loop. If you have an edge loop, select the entire loop, right-click and select Fill to fill it, or press Alt-F. Just pressing F will fill it with only one face. Both can be useful. If you have 2 or more edge loops, you can select them, right-click and select Bridge Edge Loops. They have to be part of the same object. So if you have, for example, made a hole with a knife tool, you can fill in the missing faces using this. With something selected, press Ctrl L to select everything it's connected to. You can also just press L and everything connected to what's currently under the cursor will be selected. If an object consists of several parts that aren't connected, you can separate them via Separate by Loose Parts. Many things have symmetry. Turn on mirror editing, but note that this is less powerful than using the mirror modifier. It will not mirror new geometry you create. Okay, that was everything for part 2. Please like and subscribe if you watched this far. I decided we'll save materials and texturing for next time. Then we will also look at some practical examples on how to combine everything into more complex models, how to use certain techniques, and also talk about exporting. See you then!